Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's event, a conversation with Professor Aya Gruber, author of The Feminist War on Crime. I'm Kate Mogilescu. Together with Jocelyn Simonson and Stacey Kaplow, I direct the Center for Criminal Justice at Brooklyn Law School. And our dean, Michael Cahill, will say a few words to start us off, and then we will dive right into our discussion with Professor Gruber.
Thank you so much, Kate. I just wanted to briefly do two things. The first is to say some thank yous. Even though these events are taking place remotely, they do not organize themselves. It takes a lot of work to put together something like this. So I want to acknowledge the efforts of Chris Gibbons and Liz Alper in our events office, and also Anthony Burrows, who's providing IT support for this event. It would not be happening without the help and guidance of those people. So many, many thanks to all of them for helping organize this event. Second, I just wanted to quickly say what a joy it is to be introducing an event with Professor Aya Gruber, who is joining us this evening. She and I are basically contemporaries of each other. We started teaching right around the same time, both in the area of criminal law. At some point, I vanished into the fog of law school administration, which among other things has aged me, whereas she moved on to become one of the most distinctive and distinguished academic voices of our generation in our field. She has put together a body of work that is consistently thoughtful, thorough, insightful, provocative, lucid, engaging, and not least relevant to important issues of our day, as I'm sure you will see quite clearly from the conversation that we are about to have. I am going to recede into the audience so that I can enjoy this while the panelists take center stage. So without further ado, let me turn it back to Kate for what promises to be a great event. Thanks so much. Back to you, Kate.
Thank you, Dean Cahill. So it is our pleasure to welcome Aya Gruber to this conversation. And this book talk is this year's version of an annual event that we do at the Center for Criminal Justice, where we invite someone who has recently published a book that we feel is all the things Dean Cahill just said: lucid, engaging, relevant, timely. And this year it was very clear that it would be our mission to make Aya Gruber join us for this book talk. Aya is a professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School. Like me, she is a former public defender. You have read her undoubtedly in public media. She's a frequent commentator on criminal justice issues. And I think for many of the BLS students that are attending tonight, she has also definitely made her way into your syllabi and your curriculum, and you are reading her and talking about her in class. So Aya, thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Mogilescu. I will call you Kate if you don't mind. And thank you so much for having me. That description from Dean Cahill was entirely too generous, but I am so delighted to be here. I have on this faculty dear friends and co-authors like Kate and people I admire, Professor Simonson, Professor Godso, Professor Ristrop, and you have just such a wealth of criminal law knowledge on that faculty that I am jealous a lot of the time. So thank you, Kate, for inviting me to come. Thank you, Jocelyn, for being a part of organizing this event and promoting it. And I want to thank everyone who's here. I know that this is a crazy time to go to any event. Let alone a book talk. And there are so many demands on your time. And we're all trying to figure out during a moment of so much suffering and so much social disarray, how we can best spend our time for ourselves and for others. And so I'm just really grateful that you've decided to spend some time with me in my book. So thank you to everybody who's there.
So we are here to explore The Feminist War on Crime, a book that I had long awaited, and now I'm very excited to get to talk to you about. I think it would be helpful if you could start us off by explaining the origin of this project, this book. How did you come to this?
Absolutely. So I think the origin, and this is going to sound a little bit nerdy, but I think the origin of how I started thinking about the clash between feminism and the carceral state really goes back to when I was a kid. So I grew up one of those people who were always skeptical of detention and the government and government detention schemes. And I think one of the main reasons why is that my mother was interned in a Japanese internment camp when she was a kid, right? And that was sort of a very stark example of massive race-based detention. And, and now we're seeing it repeat with just the most, it's just sickeningly clear that it's repeating with migrant children being torn away from their parents and put in concentration camps, and the horrors that are now being discovered to have been going on in those concentration camps. So anyway, when you grow up hearing about the camps, it naturally gives you this skepticism of the government's ability to detain people. But at the same time, I remember, being in high school in the 80s and being like a burgeoning feminist activist, and just, hearing in the ether that violence against women was the most pressing feminist issue, which I think, now that I'm older and I've studied it, it's not necessarily always the most pressing. And sometimes it's not even violent and not even pressing. But at that time, I had really absorbed what we call that dominance feminist framework, the idea of domination and subordination on the basis of gender, which sort of dictated that the marker of subordination for women was sexual violence. And so these were things that were just swirling around in my head. I have to be really against sexual violence, which I am, right? But the way to be really against violence against women is to be really for the government's ability to detain people accused of this crime. And then that would run up against my ideas, but yeah, do I trust the government to detain the right people? So I really felt like I was in a dilemma, but I didn't think about it much. I just had these two sort of facets where I was really feminist, really anti-rape and anti-DV, and also, wanting to be a public defender. But those things came to a head in law school. So in law school is really where I was, in the battered women's advocacy program, and I was taking this Women in the Law course with Professor Schneider, of course, reading her books. And so very in tune to those set of feminist arguments about violence against women. But at the same time, I was in the criminal justice clinic and I knew I wanted to be a public defender. So basically what happened was, when I was in law school, I resolved, I'm going to be a public defender. But I also resolved to be a public defender with a nagging dread of defending rapists and batterers, to the point where I would rehearse, like, strangely in my head what I would say to my advisor when they tried to give me a rape case and how I would decline that case. So that's really, that's a really stark thing. When I think back to my law school self, I had less qualms about defending somebody charged with first-degree murder than defending somebody charged with a misdemeanor sex assault or a misdemeanor battering charge. That's sort of how strong that dominance feminist instinct was. So that's the dilemma, I guess I would say.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk, and you, certainly the book explores this, but I've heard you specifically and very candidly talk about your own, what you call your internalized dominance feminism, or your feminist public defender ideology, which did represent the clash of these different ideas. So how did that then play out? So in a way, I wrote this book for my law school aged self, because I sat there agonizing, and of course, that's just an internal agony, and it's nothing close to, the real agonies that people are suffering. But at least as a matter of philosophy and being a law student, like agonizing over this dilemma, then I start practicing in specialized domestic violence court in the District of Columbia. I was at PDS as a public defender. And I started realizing that this was far less of a dilemma than I thought, because I had invested my hopes in this prosecutorial model, right, to solve the problem of violence against women. And then I saw it operate
up close, and how it operated was just the same as everything else, a revolving door of poverty, incarceration, and despair. And what was worse was that feminist reform had locked in some of the most pro-carceral moves, right? Because these crimes, maybe truly, but maybe not even truly, were thought to have been underreported, underenforced, too many dropped out. So the feminist reforms had taken discretion out of the system. So battered woman calls the police, mandatory arrest, no drop prosecution, specialized pleading and incarceration policies. And so what I had found that was that, a lot of the women who called would be asking me how I could help them lift the stay away order, how I can help them drop the case. Because what they didn't realize when they called the police for help was that their call would trigger an unstoppable penal machine. And that penal machine led to their partner's incarceration, possibly deportation, could cause loss of public housing, loss of employment, loss of custody. Their own freedom could be at stake if they were considered an aider and abetter, or if the police went in and found some abuse or neglect. So it was this situation where I had imagined that there was some trade-off, right? Like I had to trade some of my skepticism of prosecution for the protection that feminist prosecution afforded. And what I found out pretty quickly was that this feminist prosecution actually exacerbated some of the pathologies of the US carceral system. So I thought, geez, that's not good. And then after practicing and becoming a professor, I would write about what I had seen in the system and basically the legal mechanisms that feminists were using to push forward this feminist prosecution and how it might backfire. So I was really interested in those legal mechanisms and those legal questions. And it wasn't until this book that I really answered for myself, like, but how did we get to that point where I was a me who just, I mean, had no doubt that prosecution was the answer to violence against women. And so that's kind of what I looked at in this book.
So the book does attempt to answer that question and what the role of feminism as sort of a monolithic force has been in shaping that. I want to now get to some of the really important things that you do in the book, but I also should take a second to ask our audience as we move through this to post questions in the Q&A section. And we will be taking questions at the end, moderated by Professor Simonson. But as we move along and things come to you, please mark your questions down, share them with us, because we want to make sure we get to them as well. So let's dive into the book, shall we?
That'd be great.
You trace quite a bit of history in this book. I mean, did you know when you were setting out that that's how this would go, or how? Yeah, because you do tackle hundreds of years and very distinct points in history.
Right. So some caveats I offer up front, like one of the things you said was feminism's contribution. And feminism isn't a monolithic thing, right? So when you see these stories, whether they're 100 years ago or 30 years ago, what you see is very pitched contestations of ideology that are all within feminism. So some feminists were prosecutors. Other ones believed the state needed to be radically torn down. Some feminists were lesbian separatists who wanted nothing to do, right, with marriage norms, gender stereotypes or anything. And some were cultural feminists who lionized mothering and sort of the special way women were. So these were really distinct groups, right? And in many ways, the feminist war on crime is really a civil war. You see these contestations of feminists and who comes out on top and how that group managed to fit criminal law into their ideology. So that's one caveat. And the second caveat is I cannot tell the history of feminism and criminal law for 150 years. So I just picked out stories that really spoke to me about the state of feminist criminal reform and criminal lawmaking today, like so that I thought would speak to what's happening today. So when you look at the turn of the century cases, like 1870 on, you see a lot of the sex trafficking cases. And I tell this story about yellow panic, which was the panic over Chinese sex workers, on the West Coast. And I draw kind of at the end of the book a straight line between that and kind of policing of Asian brothels, right? Massage parlors today. So those are the two caveats. And the reason I went that far back is, and this book took about 5 years to write, was I started with the story that everybody knew, mostly on domestic violence. So what does everybody know? Everybody knows the story of the 70s. And the 70s were a time where the police officers would ignore DV calls, side with the batterer, and then the feminists stepped in and said, nope, mandatory arrest, right? And then, the prosecutors, because they didn't think they'd win the case, or they thought that the victim wouldn't show up, would drop the case. And then the feminists stepped in and said, nope, you got to have no drop prosecution. And a lot of people know that history at this point. So the first thing I looked at was, well, is that history true? Like, were cops really that way? And, was there anything on domestic violence, before that? And so the more I started studying, the farther and farther I started going back. Same with rape. I'm like, was there a rape reform before, really McKinnon? Right? McKinnon and Brown Miller and that 70s moment, 80s moment of rape shield and the move to consent. And I just figured there wasn't. And as I was tracing it back, what I learned was that one of the most successful anti-rape legal campaigns happened in the 1880s. And it was part of that, Women's Christian Temperance Union. So as I started researching the stories I was familiar with, it just took me back in time. And then once I started getting into the Civil War era on through the progressive era, I just saw so many parallels to what's happening today. And I thought to myself, wow, this really has been happening for hundreds of years.
Yeah. So you pick a few specific points of time that I want to come back to, but I want to actually start with your taxonomy of feminism that you offer in the book, because rather than saying it is monolithic and this was all one united concerted effort, you identify many different approaches, some of which you've already referenced tonight, but you give them some interesting labels. And I would love you to take us through the taxonomy that you create in the book and how it plays out.
Yeah, and I use slightly different taxonomies in different chapters, but I'll give you an example of a taxonomy I used to describe the second wave feminists. So second wave feminism was roughly between the late 70s and the mid 90s, right? And then, the students will know that a lot of their sexual harassment cases, a lot of their DV cases, they're all coming out of this time frame where feminist legal theory was really ascendant and really jurisgenerative, and it made a lot of changes. So most people think, for better or worse, that second wave feminism is sort of synonymous with taking battering seriously, as in, more criminalization, not giving men a slap on the wrist, arrests, and all the rest. But really, when you look back at the original battered women's movement, which came about in the early 70s, it really was born out of this 1968 style anti-war, anti-government, anti-racism activism, very much like today's Black Lives Matter post-Floyd movement. That was what was going on in the 70s. And so the very original battered women's movement really did not embrace police, which, the activists at the time were calling fascist pigs, right? That's kind of was the feeling on the left about the police. And so we had these radical anti-state feminists who saw battering as a matter of women's, just general inequality, but also their poverty. They saw it as a matter of racial discrimination and impoverished neighborhoods. And shelter feminists had this vision, this ideal of setting up these women-run shelters that would be highly anti-racist and highly egalitarian. So this was kind of the anti-state feminists, right? And within that, there were, Black anti-poverty, sort of welfare reform feminists. So they were welfare rights people. And they really linked battering to women's unequal status and saw it as at the intersection of racial discrimination, segregation, and poverty, right? And they said, well, if you don't want women to be stuck with abusive men, you think you would give them money. But instead, what happens is the welfare state, the government steps in, and actually Johnny Tillman, who was a Black feminist and was also the president of the National Organization for Welfare Rights, said, the government is like being in a super sexist marriage, okay? When you're in a marriage with a man, they might tell you how to use your money. When you're in the marriage with the government, they tell you whether you'll even have money, okay? When you're in a marriage with a man, they might tell you when and how to have sex. If you're in the marriage with the government, they tell you you can't have sex, and they might even tie your tubes. That's how she characterized the chains of the state when they provided women with just the basic needs of welfare. So there's that camp. But there was also this anti-patriarchy camp. And they weren't very carceral, but they were very sort of in that liberal feminist vein where women should get out, compete with the men in the workplace. And, we've got to upend, sexist marriage norms and be totally equal. And they kind of fought with the critical race feminists on, what really caused battering, because a lot of the criminal race feminists were tracing it to many social factors outside of sexism. But the anti-patriarchy feminists wanted to trace it to patriarchal norms. So I tell this story about how in 1978, we had feminists of color and sort of very, very lefty, but rich, white, well-to-do feminists squaring off over whether this was a matter of racial discrimination and poverty and sexism, or just a matter of patriarchy that spanned all races and all classes equally. And really what you see at the end of the hearing is the battering equally affects everybody, colorblind take on it, right? Race blind and class blind take on it really ruled the day. And I think that set the stage for the carceral intervention of the third group that I call legal feminists. Because really, when you think about it, even studies showed that, arrest might be the wake-up call for the white middle-class man to stop beating, or for the white middle-class woman to leave, and then she could sue him for child support, right? And so within that liberal model, maybe that worked well. But it actually was found to escalate violence amongst poor people of color. And it was found that arrest really traumatized the children and also left women of color worse off. So the very model of the every woman, what Beth Ritchie calls the every woman model, that's that colorblind, classless model. The every woman really became the every white middle class woman, and that kind of set the stage for the carceral intervention. And that was staged by legal feminists right here in New York, and lefties, the Center for Constitutional Rights that, everybody loves. And I understand why they did it. They saw case after case of beaten women who had wanted the police to intervene, but didn't get intervention. And then she ended up, more badly beaten. And so, unlike those radical activists who saw the state as the warmongering man incarnate, the lawyers saw prosecutors and courts as sort of the regular medium they worked in every day. And so this wasn't sort of capitulating to the state to them. This was, using legal tools to seek justice. So they were really the ones who pushed through this idea that we've got to have more arrests, right? And we've got to have more prosecutions. And so it was really within the legal realm that they pushed that through, because they had conceived of battering in a very, very narrow way. Battering was a matter not of all this array of social dysfunctions and inequalities, but it was a matter of the failure of law enforcement. And if we could only get that right, we solve the problem. So that's kind of how it happened. And, it was remarkably successful, because by the mid 80s, I think everybody recognized the battered women's movement as a pro-law enforcement movement for the most part.
So you tie that to legal feminists sort of paving the way and making the claim at that point that domestic violence and battering impacts everyone regardless of class, regardless of race. And that was a very sort of specific stand to take. And there were many incidents you describe in the book where they actually responded to women of color saying, no, that violence doesn't impact us all the same. And we don't want the same state response by saying, no, it does, right? Effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so like one of the stories I tell is of, a sort of face off between a shelter manager. Her name was Maria Segovia Ashley, and her remarks were read by Shelley Fernandez because she wasn't there that day. But she was the founder of La Casa de las Madres, which is the first DV shelter in San Francisco, and it was specifically to cater to Latinx women, right? And to be culturally competent, culturally sensitive, and to be sort of egalitarian all around. And, Segovia Ashley told her personal story, and her personal story involved, not only just racism from the world, being a Latina and a Mexican American in California at the time, growing up in the 60s, but also the story of her mother who was murdered by her stepfather. And this was a pretty brutal murder. The stepfather stabbed Segovia Ashley's mother and pushed her out the window to make it look like a suicide. And so the audience at this hearing, right, this was a massive government hearing with all feminist stakeholders coming, were very surprised to hear her diagnosis of her stepfather, who she called a very good man, who promised my mother the world and he meant it. And she said that because he was a Latino and he was abused by the world and forced to do manual labor in his work, he had turned into an alcoholic. And his alcoholism turned to violence. And she understood, if I could remember the words correctly, his murder as the, quote, final act of a racist society bent on two people of color annihilating each other. And that was her diagnosis of the domestic violence she felt in her life. And then a judge stood up and spoke. And I talk a little bit about her in the book. Her name was Judge Rachette. And she just had a very interesting and storied and tragic life herself. But maybe, something relevant is she was in the first class of women at Yale Law School. She was the first homicide judge. She, was in all the papers for her fashion, and, her home had these antiques. And anyway, she was a big deal. She was a big deal. And even though she wasn't assigned to respond to Segovia Ashley, she said, no, I've got to speak out against this because I totally disagree that this is a matter of white supremacy. This is a matter of what men do to all women. And to the extent that Latinos and African Americans do it more, we've got to interrogate their culture, right? So, I mean, this was a left feminist who wasn't even necessarily all that carceral, but she made it clear that, and let me say, she ended at this hearing with, hopefully there'll come a day where women's rights are taken as seriously as basically African-American rights, as civil rights, and women will have true equality. And everybody sort of leapt to their feet and clapped. And after that, an Asian woman who represented the wives of service members stood up and said, well, that's a hard act to follow, especially because I don't speak English that well. But, we in the people of color community feel like maybe some of the white feminists are replicating the very white supremacy that we think leads to battering. So all this happened in 1978, but you don't hear much about it.
That's right. That's right. Because to answer, maybe I'm doing this too soon, maybe we should tease it out to the last minute, but to answer your sort of question about who comes out on top of these competing views, I think it becomes very clear that the expansion, development, and facilitation of the carceral state comes out on top, and we understand exactly where that's landed us now. But I'm not ready to leave history yet, because I want to go back and obviously the book deals with family violence and domestic violence, but you also do a lot and explore a lot in the history of rape law. And I was actually most interested, and this might be a very small point, but because I'm the moderator, I guess I get the liberty of asking about this, was some of your exploration of the history where you talk about sort of early rape law being shaped by actually the prosecution of men in one way, but the prosecution of women also for adultery, fornication, and how the court responses and how courts viewed evidence kind of grew out of that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, and I can't take credit for this because this was Professor Coughlin, really her article that I'm channeling. But it was an interesting thing. I mean, I think what it ties into, it does tie into a really big theme of mine in my writing lately, which is to understand, just kind of diagnose the moves that feminists make that get them into this carceral state. Because I truly believe that things are moving, that feminism is moving, and there is just so much space outside of these carceral frameworks for feminism. So like, how do we get into that space, right? So I think one of the things that leads feminists into that space is this idea, this what I call feminist folk knowledge of the past. And this feminist folk knowledge is always about, and especially when it comes to rape, how law and society in the United States and Europe and elsewhere were just incredibly tolerant of men going around having forcible sex with women, and really encouraged it. Like they like just encouraged men to rape women, and the law permitted it, the law sanctioned it. So with this view of history, I think it's very natural to say, okay, if the history is sexism, and if the history is rape permissiveness and lack of criminal law, the future, the feminist future, must be very strict prosecution and criminal law, right? And getting those laws is an act of justice in themselves, come what may. So we don't have to worry about who they incarcerate, because that is a justice move. And so when you look back at the history of these laws, how they were applied, how sex was treated, it is not that linear under enforcement story that you hear in every casebook. It is a complex story of sex permissions and sex prohibitions, very much intended to confine sex to marriage, and very much intended to reinforce racial and class hierarchies. Okay, so how did that work? Well, we had highly regressive anti-liberationist sex laws on the books for outside of marriage. So adultery, right? If you were already married, you had sex outside of that marriage, adultery. If you weren't already married and you had sex outside of that marriage, fornication, right? And those were prosecuted crimes to keep sex within marriage. And then once you're in marriage, anything goes, right? I mean, forcible sex, marital exemption, right? So rape, fine, right? So it wasn't as though the laws were just like sex, 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 we love sex, let men do whatever they want. When men have sex, no, they were highly regulated, but not in marriage. Okay, so then you have a situation where, yes, people are being prosecuted under rape laws which carry death. So they were usually the more egregious ones, like, ones with children or injuries, or where there was a very high profile person or a rich person or a white woman and a black man being accused. So those, would be the death penalty ones. But then there were a lot of these adultery and fornication prosecutions. And guess what? Women were being prosecuted under these laws because this was sex regulatory of everybody. And you know what they were arguing for their defense was rape. So women would get charged with adultery and fornication, and they're probably correctly saying rape too. But of course, and any defense attorney knows this, anytime somebody makes a claim, or anytime some defendant makes a claim, and that claim is their defense, the judge is going to say to the jury, remember now, the defendant has self-protective motive to lie. That's what judges and prosecutors do. Well, they did the same thing with women. They said, oh yeah, she's saying this fornication was a rape. Well, she's a liar, right? And so it is true that these horrible doctrines are in rape law. The ones that presume, well, they are mostly gone now, but they were till the 70s and 80s, presuming women to be liars, presuming that if they didn't report right away, they must be lying. And they are terrible and sexist. But interestingly, they didn't necessarily grow out of this wanting men to rape, right? This sort of sexual license to men, so much as they grew out of a program of sexual repression for women. So it's not a linear story. When we look at rape law and sex law and anti-prostitution law and white slavery law, yes, we do see a lot of men, especially if they're upper class men, getting away with a lot, or husbands, right, getting away with a lot of rape. We do see that. But we also see, for example, in the 19 teens, this massive explosion in the construction of reformatories for girls, because we need to put them in the reformatories because they're having underage sex, right? So this was the birth of the statutory rape laws. We see this, massive corralling of women in the sex work industry on the grounds that we're protecting them, right? This is protection from sexual slavery, a term that has been, and a term that's really been reinvigorated in recent years, as Professor Mokulescu knows very well. So we're gonna do protective policing on them, but also there was a strain of it that was very middle class sensibilities. Also, these are not only women who need protection, for the sense of their own sexual safety, but these are disease vectors, right? And licentiousness vectors. And they tempt husbands and they bring disease to the good marital home. So even amongst the feminist contingents, there was always a mixed bag in there. Like that was very classed. And I kind of alluded to this on the West Coast. It was very raced. I mean, the things they said about Chinese women who came to San Francisco. This was including the feminist activists. So the purity and moralist reformers said that these were the lowest, most debased form of women, that they were inculcated culturally and innately to sexual slavery, that they were poisoning the blood of San Franciscans. And in fact, Hugh Tolan, the founder of the University of California Medical School, commissioned a study to find out the venereal effects of Asian prostitution. And so, under the banner of both racist epidemiology, right, which we're familiar with today, both racist epidemiology and this sort of racialized feminism, right, like this saving enslaved women, really what all this activism culminated in was the very first federal immigration act called the Page Act. And it was passed in 1875. And it necessitated creating an immigration force, creating border patrols, creating immigration surveillance regime, and it resulted in the virtual exclusion of all Chinese women from San Francisco.
I don't know how you unpacked all of this because it's so many things happening at once, right? It's an intense criminalization and marginalization. Sometimes it's a public health view. Sometimes it's just absolute outright racism. And then other times we're talking about saviordom, saving people, rescuing people, women primarily. And it's all kind of mixed together in this hodgepodge that has taken us through these turns of legal history. I want to, I think I would probably be remiss if I didn't talk about how you and I met, and some of the things we've worked on together and how this fits, how that fits into this. So I first met Aya when she came charging up to the podium after I spoke on a panel about some of the work that we were doing in New York on the human trafficking intervention courts, which were courts designed to sort of revamp the way prostitution offenses were adjudicated in New York. And since so much of the book talks about sex work and the policing of prostitution, how does sort of this era, and you talked actually in your introduction about practicing in an alternative court, a problem-solving court, the domestic violence specialized court.
Mm-hmm.
Where do specialized courts fit into this legal history, and also sort of what influences or what factors led us there?
You know, something I didn't get into, which if I had another chapter in another year, I would, was that back in the progressive era, these cases were also in a specialized women's courts, right? So they would there's always been this idea of women and their crimes or their victimhood or their mixed victimization crimes, right, being sort of a special and unusual character and ripe for alternative justice. And as we know, alternative justice can have a mixed bag. We sort of in detail looked at, what is the legacy of these human trafficking intervention courts? Well, they did seem to reduce the number of arrests, certainly convictions, and jail time. I mean, that's positive, right? But did they extend the life of prostitution interdiction under the guise of human trafficking longer than society would have tolerated it, right? Like maybe society would have just said legalize if, this hadn't been the palatable criminalization. So there are all these things to think about. But I think, when I heard Kate talking about how the police would use, this was particularly condoms, as evidence against women, right? As a prosecutorial evidence. I was just so sickened by that. I mean, that is the perverse incentives that leads to, are horrible. And just the treatment of the women was so horrible that I was actually shocked. So I said, can this be? And she said, oh yeah, let me tell you what's going on. And so we started studying these human trafficking courts. And it's really a situation where it is very self-consciously feminist. It is very well-meaning feminism, but it's also at the same time pretty top-down, a little bit tone-deaf to some of the racial and cultural realities, like with women who may be from a foreign country and, language barriers and things like that, or to the reality of sex work and the options that people have. And it introduced into the lexicon, I think, and this was only a piece of it, a brand new vector of very tough on crime politics, and that's the trafficking vector. And if you can fit things into this trafficking vector, they might be the same thing. They might just be rounding up poor women of color and jailing them. But if you can fit them into a trafficking vector, they sort of tweak that feminist imagination of doing good for the worst women among us, but without all the baggage or maybe critique that some of the rape reforms and sex offense laws and battered women's programs have accrued so far. So like nobody touches sex trafficking as, something that's properly criminalized. So I think, that was one of the legacies of seeing in New York, seeing all sex work under the rubric of trafficking is it may have, had some really good practical effects, but there's a bigger dialogue of this. And I think where it came out to me even more starkly, and I think, Kate, you were the first one to tell me about this too, and then I dug into it, was in the Rhode Island situation, where for 20 years, indoor prostitution was decriminalized. There was a sex worker civil rights suit in the 1980s, and what it led to was, and it was against the fact that prostitution was a felony. So this was what the suit was about, but in rewriting the statute, basically the legislature had left out the actual commercial transaction, right? So as long as there was no soliciting or pandering or, other things, the actual transaction of sex for money wasn't a crime. And it stood that way for 20 years until a coalition formed in around 2005. But this all came to a head in 2009. That was a coalition between sort of Christian conservatives, shop owners, right, the commercial establishment, and feminist anti-traffic people. And all three of those groups didn't like the growing number of Asian massage parlors that were in Providence. So they introduced legislation to recriminalize the act of prostitution, to basically recriminalize the women. And, the ACLU came out against it, a lot of civil rights organization, and said, no, we don't need to put women in jail here. And so they reintroduced the package, but they renamed it as anti-trafficking, right? And they put it together with some other anti-trafficking felony laws. And, you know, the Coalition Against Trafficking, even though they didn't endorse the recriminalizing prostitution part, they said we're going to take no stance on the entire package. And the entire package, despite the fact that many of the Asian workers themselves came bravely to the floor of the legislature to say things like, just give me a few more years in this, you know, industry to get my life together, or to put my daughter through college, or to pay off my bills. You know, please, please, please don't recriminalize me right now. Even though they had stood on the floor of the legislature to say that, the legislature passed that recriminalization act, and now the legislature has commissioned a study of whether they should decriminalize it again, now 10 years later. So that to me was very telling of the effect, you know, that the resurgence of the feminist concern with sex slavery is having on some marginalized groups of women.
I mean, almost inseparable from criminalization. Even if you take a small break for, you know, a little while, you just end up back there.
Yeah, and it was, you know, it is an amazing thing to see just how carceral the narrative of sex trafficking is. When, like, for example, when you look at the Robert Kraft case, I don't know if you've all heard about that. That was the Patriot owners, and it made a splash way back when, you know, maybe the world wasn't falling apart as much, so it could make a splash. But what had happened was that, you know, there has been this form of trafficking interdiction that's pretty racist. It's where these mainly white male detectives, you know, in Florida, target Asian-run massage parlors, and they call it, you know, crazy things. Like some of them were called like Operation Rub Down and Operation Gilded Cage. And so, you know, one of the police reports in Florida referred to massage parlors as the standard Asian model of prostitution. I mean, really racist stuff. And so, you know, in one of these, what they would do is they would go onto rubmaps.com, and they'd find out who's talking about what massage parlor. They go sit out front, and they'd wait for men to leave, and then they would follow their cars, stop them on pretextual traffic stops, right? Like, you know, should be unconstitutional, but anybody who's taken Crim Pro and read Ren knows they're not. So these pretextual stops, and get them to confess basically to having received sexual services. So on the basis of these pretextual stops, they went and got a sneak and peek warrant, which also is a very marginal constitutionality, put it in the massage parlor, and for 5 days, watched the women and men in real time. Okay, and then they made a bunch of arrests of men and a bunch of arrests of women for trafficking offenses in the massage parlor, the workers and the owners. The men's were eventually dropped, and they're suing because of all the constitutional violations. But the women, and I checked, there's still a lot of charges pending, were hit with an array of charges, up to 15 years in prison. And yet at the same time, Dave Ehrenberg, who is West Palm Beach attorney, went out there and said, human trafficking is evil in our midst. And we have done, you know, everything we can to fight human trafficking. Well, no men, you know, went to jail. And I'm not sure they should have with all the violations there. But there were surely a lot of Asian women who got all their assets seized and were sent to jail. And what Ehrenberg said was, you know, and if they cooperate with us, you know, they'll somehow get help. But in reality, they were charged with a bunch of prostitution felonies, you know, not given a human trafficking out. There was none under the law, and they just put women in jail. So that's kind of how that worked out.
So human trafficking is one of the things where the rhetoric has been at a fever pitch for quite some time now, and you and I have charted that, and that leads to this deep entrenchment in the carceral state in a way that evades inclusion in any sort of current discussion about moving away from carceral models, right? So we are in this moment where we're talking very, very deeply about the role of police, the role of prosecutors, who's criminalized for what. And somehow when we come to a certain subset of offenses, we can't, our radical reimagining that's happening right now has to stop, because, well, what about rape? What about trafficking? What about domestic violence? What about exactly the things you talk about in the book, right?
Right. So I think if you have what about questions, this is a really good book for you. And I think this is a really good book for you anyway. So, I think that people, when it comes to defund the police, people more on the right and more on the left have their own what about questions. So you might get, for example, a moderate Democrat, and their what about question is, what about when somebody is breaking into my home? Right? I mean, that's one that's gaining a lot of traction and scaring a lot of people. And I know when I talk about defund or police reform, and I'm sure other people on the faculty like Professor Simonson and Professor Mogilewski can weigh in on what their answer is, but I always ask, well, have you ever called the police, and have they ever come to your house and stopped a robbery in progress? And most people say no. And I'm like, yeah, because that's mostly not what the police are doing, right? And that's certainly not what street policing is doing. Street policing isn't in your neighborhood, right? Your neighborhood is depoliced. And then when you call them, if you had a robbery, which you probably haven't, and if the person's still there, which they probably aren't, they're way more likely to come right away to you than a person in a police neighborhood. So we have sort of our set of answers to the whatabouts that come from maybe the right, but what about the whatabouts that come from the left? And those generally have to do with gender, and there are some other ones that we can talk about too, but it's the what about rape question and what about domestic violence question. And I find the what about domestic violence question a little bit easier to answer, because we have right now, a growing anti-carceral domestic violence movement, groups like Incite, right? Groups like Survived and Punished, groups like Black and Pink, and I suppose also anti-sexual violence, but also anti-carceral. But like on the DV front, it's pretty amazing, because if you remember from any of your DV case books or your criminal law case book, you've probably only heard of one sociological study. And that's probably the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment. And that was done in '84. It was a relatively modest experiment. And just in a nutshell, it found that out of 3 random choices, having, temporarily removing the abuser from the house, or the person accused from the house, arresting the person, or giving a warning to the person, right? Out of those 3 options, arrest predicted the greatest decrease in repeat violence, right? So we always hear about that study, the Minneapolis study, and it's true that study made a splash. Other things were making a splash in 1984. We had movies, we had hearings, we had lots of things on DV awareness in 1984. So I understand kind of why that study made a splash, and I talk about it a lot in the book. What I don't understand is why that study continues to make a splash. Because at the same time, as people were putting that study into their case books and their newspapers and their position papers, Lawrence Sherman, who's the sociologist who, along with Richard Burke, ran that study, and a group of co-authors were doing much larger scale replication studies over a longer period than the 6 months that was in the Minneapolis studies in many jurisdictions. And what they found was that it wasn't clear at all that domestic violence arrest versus other non-arrest alternatives really did predict less violence. And in fact, amongst unemployed men, and especially unemployed men of color, it had a precipitous escalatory effect, right? So in other words, it increased domestic violence, right? And so all these studies were coming out exactly after the 1984 study, to the point where in 1992, Sherman and his co-authors felt comfortable enough to proclaim, quote, mandatory arrest may make as much sense as fighting fire with, wait. There's little sense, I forget the phrase. Fighting fire may make as much sense as fighting fire with fire. I remember it. Make as much sense as fighting fire with gasoline. That's what he said. So, I mean, this is what the scientist himself was saying in the early 90s. So how is it that today, when we're in such an street policing moment, right? An arrest skeptical moment, we still kind of grab onto that arrest is best model when, the social science itself showed it to be sort of inefficacious, and it's received just an absolute windfall in funding compared to non-carceral alternatives. So I find the what about DV pretty easy to dismiss because we have just a wealth of evidence that arrest doesn't make things better a lot of the times, right? And actually, a lot of people are saying we should have trained family violence people going in there, right? People who know how to de-escalate, know where the options are, know how to deal with children. We don't have to subject the children to the trauma of an arrest. And the funny thing about it was that was a model in the late 60s that I at least argue some of the feminist agitation put the final nail in the coffin of that non-arrest model.
Well, I mean, to go back to the shelter feminists that you were describing and thinking about also this whole practice being built on a subset of people who have experienced violence who actually sought separation from the person who had harmed them and sought police intervention, that everything kind of flowed from that. So the shelter activists, even though they might have been sort of anti-government in a lot of ways and hoping for a utopian ideal that you described, how'd they interact with the police? How'd they feel about the police?
Yes, so it's a really interesting thing because I don't know if you all remember, but when the Amy Cooper video surfaced, that was the bird watching Christian Cooper, and she had called the police. And when she later apologized, she said, well, I think I was wrong for considering the police to be a free protection agency because other people just don't have that luxury. And that really struck me because it reminded me almost of an exact quote that I have in my book from shelter feminists who were wrestling with the new carceral model in the late 70s and early 80s. And they were saying, we want to express solidarity with, at the time, the word third world was sort of synonymous with people of color, people of different socioeconomic classes, marginalized people. So what the shelter feminists, we want to express solidarity with third world women and third world people. And we know that policing is a force for violence in their lives. However, we have to say that here at the shelter, when the police show up, they're so respectful to our residents, and we rely on them heavily because we have a published address, and they're basically like the security guard here. And so, we're really in a conundrum. And they admitted it, right? They admitted as much. They said, I think maybe the difference between our retreat, our shelter, and some of the people in those quote unquote third world communities is that, once the police see that the woman has left, right? And then they see this organized shelter that's sort of managing these women, they're fine with providing security services. It's a very different scenario when the woman has agency in her own home. And maybe that's agency is saying, I don't want you here, right? I don't want you to arrest. Or that agency has to do with other crimes that may be going on in the house, right? So when a battered woman, to a police officer was just, an ideal, somebody they didn't even see behind the closed doors. Yeah, they could do the security service without harming the woman, but that's not what happened in a lot of the homes of the most marginalized women that the police were interfacing with, and they were disproportionately interfacing with them.
It just is another opportunity for us to sort of note that people who experience violence and harm are not monolithic, also just like feminists aren't monolithic, and that people desire a range of responses. But the responses that have come out on top tend to track the legal feminists that you've identified in their agenda. And you also are, I think, are kinder to them probably than I am, I think.
Yes, I think you can't, I was about to say 2020 is hindsight, but I think it's more like I want to put 2020 in hindsight. But right, I mean, but we can look back and say this, that, and the other. But I think what can help is understanding history and the factors that move people one way or the other. And so again, we can now be lawyers, but understand that our legal frames are necessarily court-centric, law-centric, state-centric frames can make us maybe more sanguine about law and law enforcement and the intervention of law. So we could be lawyers who realize that, and that can be part of the story of how we realize that. We can also realize that, we should be somewhat careful about successes with reforming from within, right? So that was a lot of the idea, is that the insertion of these deviant rape reforms will make the carceral state more feminist. Well, it didn't. It certainly made feminism more carceral, right? So we can have some insight as to that move also. So I mean, I don't judge them per se, but what I would say is I think times are changing a little. I think, there are rapid political shifts right now among young people. So a year ago, it was all about Me Too, which I see as a very incarceration-centric movement, right? We need zero tolerance for rape and sexual harassment and crimes against women, and we interpret that in many instances as long 25, 26, year lifetime jail sentences. So moving from that over to going on the street and saying we need to defund the police, those are wide social moves. And I think they both come from a basic place of wanting to be on the right side of marginalized folks, right? Like of women who are subjected to violence, or of people of color subjected to state violence. So I think they all come from a good place, but without knowing the history of how these, movements, especially feminism, has, flowed in certain times and made strange bedfellows and made certain compromises, I don't think we're in as good of a place to navigate these things. So I think today, when all the sensibility is on defunding and abolition and rethinking the carceral state, you can listen to an abolitionist, like, for example, Miriam Kaba, who says, I'm a former, I'm a person who survived sexual violence. And I don't believe policing is the answer, because I don't think that I think, they come with these pathologies, and I don't think that carceral model is, in the end of the day, a healing model for victims either. Now, that is a perspective. You're going to find plenty of victims of rape, right, and sexual violence who are like, no, I want jail, right? And so I would like to say to young feminists who also want to be anti-carceral, you can have it all. You can be pro-victim and anti-incarceration. And look, here's a victim over here who's also anti-incarceration and wants to heal through a restorative justice circle, or just through forgetting about it, or through anything else, or maybe helping other marginalized women. That's great. There is that. But there's also this over here, which is you're going to get an enormous amount of victims of gendered violence who say, I'm not going to feel a sense of justice until I see someone in jail. And I think, that's just true. Now, I have 2 chapters in my book in dealing with victims' rights and whether the criminal law should be based on the desires of the victim. And I think we can have a framework for it. But one of the things I think that every person with a critique or an agenda has to have is to sit with their own discomfort, right? Because nobody can have it all. Nobody can satisfy every contingent. I think that, I have opinions about like what to do about victims who want to see incarceration. But I think in the end of the day, if you are not for that level of high incarceration that some victims want, one of the costs of a decarceral program is going to be the dissatisfaction of those victims. And, so I just think that's true. So I totally agree that there are so many answers to the what about rape question. But one of the things in this moment of people sort of being radically aware of the perils of policing and prosecution and prison is also to understand, why people have thought it benefits women for so long.
And why people continue to only view accountability through a criminal system as the only mode of accountability, for sure. A lot more to say there, I know, but I promised I would open it up to questions, even though I just want to keep asking you my own. So I'm going to ask Professor Simonson to help us with the Q&A at this point. Thank you.
Hi, thank you both so much for that amazing conversation. Professor Mogilewski and Professor Gruber are too modest to say so, but they've written together about some of these issues. So you can find their articles about penal welfare, about the ideology of some of these courts that claim to be helping women, but perhaps have some perverse effects of those ideologies. So read that stuff too, in addition to this wonderful book. So I'm looking at questions. Please put some more questions if you have them. But I'm lucky to get to read through some of the questions that I have here. And so we've been talking a fair amount about the past. I'm gonna give you two questions about the present and the future that I see here, and see what you think. The first one I'm gonna read is from Colin Chipatine, and really centering us right now in the pandemic. And so he writes, throughout this pandemic, we've seen not only the increase of the vastly growing inequality of the American wage gap problem, but recent highs in reported domestic violence. Do you think that the inevitable increase in cases brought to court, or now I'm editorializing, just the reported increase in domestic violence itself, he asks, will finally force the justice system to re-examine the precedent of hostility shown towards those cases and women as a whole? So is the domestic violence during the pandemic going to shift things? And then we also have another question from Mike Valensky, which is more about ideological struggle right now, and wondering if there are growing efforts around the country to fully decriminalize sex work has the potential to shift ideology in different ways, perhaps narrowing the gap between anti-carceral and carceral feminism. So this is an invitation to talk broadly about the future.
Yeah, I think the COVID question is great. So I think we have to start with the question of what one might mean by saying the courts are hostile to women. Usually what that signals to me is the idea that they don't take domestic violence seriously enough, as in they don't arrest enough people for domestic violence or keep them in jail for long enough. And because of that, we have higher incidences of domestic violence. And I would say that claim is not borne out by most of the sociological evidence, because most of the sociological evidence, first of all, I think we're pretty carceral on domestic violence. We're at a point in which domestic violence arrests outpace non-domestic assault arrests, and the sentences are now higher, which is, so it's not a situation where there's some comparator of seriousness and somehow they're not taken seriously by that comparative. And also, I have this in my book too. If you look at, arrests declining over time, arrests have declined with the crime decline, right? There's fewer incidents of crime, there's fewer people to arrest for the crime, but not DV, right? Like, so the policies of widely arresting kept DV arrest rates very high. So I would say that the idea of being sort of more carceral in a moment where arguably, and the statistics are still coming in, domestic violence is increasing, it's probably not going to bear more fruit than at other times. Now, I think if domestic violence is increasing, it totally makes sense, because the level of stress and inequality and just, where am I going to get my next meal? The level of that amount of stress that is being produced by this pandemic and the utter failure and incompetency of our government to deal with people who are hurting right now and who are in need is immense. And social scientists have long said that those kind of stressors predict violence within the home, and everybody's stuck within the home. So those things just make for domestic violence. Now, I don't think the answer is to arrest everybody, because not only has it been shown to be somewhat escalatory, this is a COVID moment where a pass through court and back home, right, that revolving door I'm talking about, is not just sort of stressful and you can lose your job and things like that, but it can also pass around a deadly disease. So I would say that the solution to the epidemic of violence, if there is indeed one, is very similar to the solution to the epidemic, right? Which is, we need to get it under control and test and trace. We need to give people a way to live and work, and we need to give them the means to live, and we need to give them the means to deal with children who are at home 24/7 on a computer when they don't have good broadband, making everybody have internal family stressors. So there's so many things we can be doing for these families. I believe, based on my research, one of them should not be arresting a parent. So that was the first question. The second question on sex work, I mean, absolutely. I think this is one of the things that Kate and I were trying to say in our Human Trafficking Intervention Court or Penal Welfare article was, you know, it's really great to keep prostitution on the books as a crime, or, you know, I mean, and I'm going to have a second part of the really great. And then, you know, make it less punished than it was before, to decrease arrests, decrease convictions. That's all really great, right? It's not so great when you recriminalize, but that's great if you're sort of ratcheting down the carceral response to women. But it's not so great if it's preserving a set of crimes that society is ready to fully decriminalize. And so we wonder, and I haven't gone back to it, and I'm still wondering, I'm still on the fence about it, whether New York or other places would be ready to just fully decriminalize. They don't have to do it on the books. They could do it by the prosecutors coming out and saying, we're not going to prosecute these cases, or the police coming out and saying, we're not going to, you know, arrest for these cases, or some other way, right? So informal or formally repealing. If that's close, and I think we're closer than we've been for a long while, then you wonder, then the conundrum is this: should I be in support of these diversionary programs and these alternative problem-solving programs that are better than straight incarceration, but might prolong the life of still the women having to interface with very aggressive sexist police officers, for example? And so I think that this is the interesting moment we're in.
Thank you. So now I'm gonna shift to, we have so many great questions. I'm trying to gather them together. There are a few questions about race and gender identity in different ways and how it may interplay with the ideas in your book, and also sort of your views of feminism more generally. One question is about how trans women, and specifically Black trans women, fit into your analysis of feminism, and also maybe how they played a role in the history of some of the anti-carceral feminism, like Insight. This is me editorializing the question. Right. But also there are questions about when males are the survivors of violence, or when there are male victims, and whether that was a part of the history at all, or whether it's a part right now of some of this contesting ideology. So you can choose to answer either or both of those, but just sort of how gender differences and gender identity might play into some of these, especially as it overlaps with race.
They're really great questions. And I, you know, put a pretty big hedge early on in the introduction of the book that, you know, and if you're interested in it, I'd be happy to send it to you, that the book is very gendered in a way that makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because I think one of the problems with the feminist movement and why it became so carceral was because of the gender binary. You know, a very F versus M, you know, F must be promoted at the expense of M, right? So I'm way more postmodern than that just in my comportment. But it would be very hard for me to talk about the history of feminism in criminal law if I didn't speak about it on the terms feminists have spoken about it. And feminists have considered it, and again, I think, you know, this is part of the problem, as a distinctly gendered phenomenon. That is, male on top subordinator, female on bottom, you know, the subordinated party, the abused party. And maybe you could have some fudging in that if men are sexually abused, you say, for example, like Catherine McKinnon, they operatively become female. And when women are abusers, they're performing male, right? Like, so this is the terms upon which they speak. And so they always had this binary. And one of the problems, and one of the reasons I think that, you know, one of my suspicions, and I kind of lay this out through stories and don't come out and say it, but I'll just come out and say it now. One of my suspicions why feminism became so carceral, and it's, you know, no big secret now, there's actually a lot more writing on it these days, is because women, and especially white women, are uniquely immune to the pathologies of criminal processing. They get arrested less. When they get arrested, there's less force used. When they are processed, they get charged with lighter offenses. When they are sentenced, they're more likely to get probation, right? And so women are uniquely immune to criminal law. So it seems like a win when men are the one doing things bad. You throw the criminal law at the men, right? Like, it's all a win for the women. And so that binary, I think, you know, and there's a race binary in there too, led to carcerality in a way in which, if we thought of multiple intersecting identities and the ways in which subordinate identities are related, it wouldn't have gone that way, because we would realize, well, there are Black women, there are trans women, there are men of color who are subordinated, and, you know, there are white women who are mothers of men who are white men who are in jail, right? So I think it's part of the reason that it comes off as such a binary book, is that this has been a lot of what feminist engagement with criminal law has been. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think in the queer theory space, for example, you could take even sex radicals of the 1980s, right? And you could also look at the trans movement and how, you know, trans people consider private violence against them to be one of their greatest health issues, right? Their greatest survival issues, but at the same time, don't see the violent anti-trans masculinist police as the solution to that private, also masculinist anti-trans violence. So yeah, that movement has been huge. And I would say, you know, again, feminism isn't monolithic. I did include Insight, but it's more towards like the modern day. But I did talk a lot about like the Combahee Collective and Black feminists and anti-poverty, pro-welfare feminists, because again, this was more like a civil war. But the terms of legal feminism were pretty specific, and they were pretty gendered. And those genders were like opposite poles, right? And there's this feeling that the more punished men get, the more healing women get, right? And in reality, you know, life isn't polar like that. And that's what sort of questioning those kind of identity moves is really great for helping us think that way.
Thanks. There's so many other wonderful questions, but I don't want to keep everybody too long. But just know that you have all these really engaged questions, and also people just saying thank you in the Q&A. Professor Mogilescu, I'm going to turn it back to you.
So now is my opportunity to thank you, not in the Q&A, but to thank you right here. So Aya, this has been a wonderful discussion. The book is important, it's necessary, it takes us back to where we really need to start looking at this. And you point out, you know, most people's conception is that this feminist history starts at a specific point and is only in this space. But you also really highlight organizing, different types of feminist organizing outside of the carceral state. And while yes, I think it's fair to say that the legal feminists ended up on top here, I'm not sure how much longer that's going to be, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I have to say this other caveat. There are a million, you know, stories of amazing feminist reform that has nothing to do with incarceration. They were just not these stories.
Sure. But thinking now and hearing you sort of say this book was a dedicated or directed towards your law student self, I think you've given the law students and practitioners that have joined us tonight a lot to think about, a lot that is incredibly important for us to work out as we move through right now. What are our systems going to look like, and who gets to say? And you know, I would just say that and you talk about this at places in the book, and thinking about the binaries you just identified that are so limiting in so many ways that our criminal legal system is built on and can't really move away from. But often the real weight of that, as we know and has been well studied, falls on people of color, but women of color particularly. And so thank you for the work that you do in this book to make us think about that and think about what we need to do differently. It's been really wonderful having you tonight. Everyone should go buy her book. Every single person. If you haven't been assigned it in class already, go buy it. And I hope that this is a conversation. Yes, I'll hold mine up as well.
I got one back here too.
But I thank you all for joining us tonight, for the amazing questions. And I hope that this conversation that we've begun tonight will continue in our classes, in our spaces, and when we're able to see each other and connect. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much.